Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode, and I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I'm a writer. I've written a few things. Right now, of course, this will come out after this is no longer true. My book, In the House of Tom Bombadil, is free on Kindle as a part of No Quarter November promotions. Anyway, when you hear this, it's going to be too late to get that. Sorry to do that to you. But anyway,
just rubbing it in their face.
Right. Anyway, I've done a number of things, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, Tom, how about you?
I'm Tom Price, primarily a teacher. I teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Okay, great. Glenn, why don't you introduce yourself and then take us into the topic of the day, because it's your day.
Yes, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, which is another way of saying I'm retired from there. I was a specialist in Renaissance and Reformation Europe, did a lot of stuff with medieval. I have my own 501c3 ministry called Every Square Inch Ministries. That's at esquareinch.org. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, work for Reflections Ministries, do freelance speaking and teaching, and a bunch of other things that generally keep me off the streets. So I am... when people ask me what I do, I find it a little bit difficult to explain. But anyway, the topic for today is actually coming off of a Breakpoint article that came up recently from a story that I actually remember when it came up, and it involves sheep.
All right.
As it turns out, there's a man. Let me get his name. His last name was Schubarth, I believe. Yes, Arthur Schubarth, who's an 81-year-old man in Montana who is spending 6 months in federal prison for illegally cloning sheep. It turns out that he managed to acquire tissue from a Marco Polo argali, that's a rare and protected species of bighorn sheep from Kyrgyzstan. And when he got this tissue, he began cloning it. He got a cloning facility to clone it and create embryos. And then he began breeding these, he called them Montana Mountain King sheep. It turns out it was a 300-pound hybrid breed with curling horns. And then he bred these to North American bighorn sheep, which actually resulted in even larger hybrid species, which he began selling, as I'm reading here, to captive hunting preserves for up to $10,000 a head.
Okay. Well, this is too rich. For one thing, we got an 81-year-old dude who's got enough spare time to engage in illegal cloning. But the thing about it, you think Montana, you think if there's a place where this would be okay, it would be Montana. But even Montana has its limits.
Well, notice it's the feds that went after him.
That's right. That's right. Right.
He also, by the way, sold dozens of DNA samples to breeders around the country.
Oh wow! So this thing is already beyond, it's already broken out of the farm, so to speak.
Yeah.
So
out of the container.
So what we've got now are potentially Sheepzillas running around somewhere, and the problem is from the Fed's perspective. The problem here is that we don't really know the genetic makeup of these things. We don't know if it's introducing a weakness that could make them more susceptible to diseases, which could then spread to other populations. And further, if they should end up getting loose, it could end up compromising the genetics of wild domestic bighorn sheep populations. So that's what they're concerned about.
Interesting. But, one of the things, though, that to think about, human beings have been involved in, you could say, genetic modification for like ages. The old-fashioned way is you'd actually bring one of those big sheep over here and have that sheep breed with a native sheep, and you'd end up with a new thing. But if you do it in the way that you just described, cloning, apparently this is another wrinkle, and I don't know enough about what that means scientifically to make it any kind of appraisal of whether or not that's a significant difference. But anyway, it does seem odd.
Yeah, this struck me as being sufficiently weird that I thought it was worth it.
Right.
Now, there. Okay, so let's talk about the idea of selective breeding. We have all kinds of very specific breeds of sheep and cattle and horses and things like that were the product of selective breeding, and we don't have a problem with that. What seems to be the problem here is, well, number one, they didn't actually bring the sheep over. It's an endangered species, so it's protected. One would think that cloning an endangered species and producing a viable sheep would be a good thing, but they didn't want it brought over the way it was brought over. It didn't go through all of the proper channels and the checks and everything else that would be involved in that. That seems to be part of the problem here. But in a lot of ways, there really isn't too much of a conceptual difference between that and selective breeding.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that. But I think the fact that it didn't go through the proper channels and the testing and all of that is the thing that makes them a bit worried. Now, the other part of it, and one of the things that most people don't realize, is that Dolly, the first cloned sheep, named Dolly, by the way, because it was cloned from the mammary of the original sheep. Dolly was the only one of a large number of attempts at cloning that actually survived into maturity. Most of the others had all kinds of genetic defects, and even Dolly died young.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the question is the cloning itself actually, well, successful? Does it produce a truly viable sheep, or are we introducing potential genetic complications that wouldn't have been there had we actually brought one of these sheep over and bred it here?
Yeah, that's an interesting
technical problems here.
Yeah, I'm completely in the dark as to whether or not cloning is an ongoing thing. This particular lab, the fact that it exists seems to indicate that something's going on an ongoing basis. I just don't know enough to
Yeah,
say.
I think there's enough that's being done and a lot of playing around that's going on. I mean, you see it with viruses. You see it with almost everything. Sooner or later they do get out and they can wreak havoc.
But
maybe we're getting a lot better at cloning than we used to. I just don't know.
And that strikes me as being a distinct possibility. We've had 20 some odd years of doing it since Dolly, and it may be that we've got the technology better.
Yeah.
We really need somebody who knows more about the technical ends of the biology here and the technology to really answer those questions. I'm interested in it more from an ethical, philosophical kind of angle. It may be that there are problems there. I don't know, but it raises all kinds of questions in my mind. First of all, again, what is the real difference between this and selective breeding that we already do? But then along with that, if this is illegal, then what do we do with things that are going on with, let's say, sperm banks, and functional selective breeding that we do that way with people? In vitro fertilization, IVF, all of these kinds of things. It seems to me that there are some implications that are worth considering when it comes to the way we treat things, even in terms of human beings here. When you're using CRISPR to modify genes, all of these kinds of things. They seem to me to be sort of related issues here.
Yeah. Strikes me that there are kind of different categories of, inquiry. For example, if we were to think about just, say, produce, fruits and vegetables and stuff like that, I've seen examples of unmodified, or at least conceptually presented, sort of drawings of like the early like corn, for example, years of corn before all of the things that we've done to make it much more fruitful. In other words, corn much more palatable and plentiful. Basically, if I remember correctly, native corn, in its native condition was about the third of the size that the ears of corn are now. So we've had that, and then the question is what's different about the selective, sort of breeding that goes on when, a farmer says, okay, I want to have a larger tomato, and then just takes tomatoes and keeps, limiting, what's happening with the production of tomatoes season over season, so they get bigger, and some kind of more direct Frankenfood approach. Is there kind of a yuck factor that maybe comes into play? Like when I think about lab grown meat, that there's a yuck factor. For me, I'm like, I don't even want to try it. Even though maybe people would say it's more humane or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is we don't know, and that's really where a lot of the problem sits. Of course, we do know with certain attempts of cloning, the high failure rate of, viable embryos, especially with them trying to do it with humans. Then there's the health issue of the organs. There doesn't tend to be usually very healthy or long-lived episodes. And then, there are a whole kind of physical defects that can happen. Again, this doesn't mean that down the road that can't be tweaked out. That's part of what goes on here. But it definitely introduces something that the gift of nature itself tries to wean out of the process.
I think there's also the complexity. There's a tendency on the part of people who take a very pro-interventionist approach to, say, modifying anything natural, to underestimate the likelihood that there are things that are going on that we don't understand or don't appreciate. For example, like the difference between farm-grown salmon and wild salmon is enormous. But you wouldn't necessarily think that going into the whole process of raising farmed salmon, but it's something you discover after you've done it for a while. Like, wow, this stuff doesn't taste as good. It's not as healthy, that kind of thing.
Well, and this is especially true when it comes to messing around with genes. Because we're really good at mapping the genome. We know what the genes are in it, but what we don't really know is what they do exactly. We know some of what they do, but the interactions between the genes, the way the so-called junk DNA, which is anything but junk, actually operates. We've got an idea of it, but we don't really understand everything that's going on. So if you actually go in and tweak something, it may solve one problem or cause a bigger tomato or something like that. But it may also have unforeseen consequences elsewhere. Because again, all of the genetic interactions that go on within the genome, we really don't know all of those things yet. And so the question is whether we actually have enough knowledge to dink around with stuff, whether that is in fact a wise thing to do. Now, I have to say there are some things that we can do that seem to be very effective and make sense. I've seen genetic treatments to eliminate sickle cell disease, where you can actually introduce modified genes that will have had a pretty good track record at fixing it. No problem with stuff like that, in my mind. Although it is worth noting that you really do need to pay attention to see what this does over generations.
Yeah, there's the classic, healing versus enhancement distinction, and I think everybody would say, I would hope everybody would say, in the case of something like sickle cell anemia, it's worth the risks in order, because we know the downside of not treating it. If let's try some stuff and see if we can't develop an approach that really addresses that problem.
Right. And the other thing that you also have to factor in is the difference between genetic modification of specific things within a body and germ cell modification. Germ cell modification are things that will be passed on to your children. Mm-hmm. And if you modify germ cells functionally, what you are doing is experimenting on the next generation without their consent.
Yeah, that's a great point.
There are serious ethical considerations involved with that.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's the larger question as well, is that, as we tinker with stuff, it's not just the immediate, the moment that we're in that's affected. It's who knows where this is going to go.
Yeah. And you think, a lot of times, we often talk about just kind of what kind of human activity is, in terms of, just say, the Dominion mandate is, what kind of limit is set there? And a lot of times people emphasize that, of course, it's the ability to have the human help take the natural world's potential and develop it. And things are mysteriously full of all kinds of amazing potential. That's the amazing thing, is you take anything that is, there's enough in that isness about its whatness that allows it to have all this capacity for all kinds of things beyond what's realized. And then what ends up happening is we come in and start playing with that, recognizing that there is plenty to do here and plenty we can play with, but some of it is going outside of the range of what is, one, I think it's ready for, but also other things have to be in consideration. Matter of fact, just take a plant. A plant has a setting in which it depends on, in which other things depend on it. And for everything that we do that moves beyond kind of, things like healing, we start to enter into territory which we're doing more than just for the plant, but everything that is dependent on it and it depends on. So we're affecting a whole wide range of things that I just don't think we have the wisdom to know how to handle. And this is where I think that fine line becomes something that has to become solid in some places.
Just think of the Chihuahua. What have we done with?
Before we walk the line, Chris, I just want to note the phrase, the isness of its whatness. we really need to note that phrase.
Well, we can quote Tom, the isness of its whatness.
You can tell I taught philosophy this morning.
Yes, but go on about the Chihuahua.
Well, I'm just thinking, the fact that Chihuahuas don't exist in nature. They only exist in our homes. In other words, in nature, Chihuahuas are like sitting ducks. To mix my metaphors, but there's the grossness factor too. Is again, like if let's say we could take some of our regulators back in time and have them talk to the early dog breeders and say, you realize where this is going to go, don't you? It's going to result in this, and they have them show a picture of a Chihuahua. Do you really want to go there?
There's a great cartoon that was out a while a meme that had a picture of a wolf looking at a campfire, a couple of wolves, and one of them saying to the other, we should really go up and check this out. How bad could it be? And the next picture is a picture of a dog in a tutu.
Well, that's it. So now getting back to the environment thing, Chihuahua are pets, and they're generally pets for a certain kind of person who delights in a very small creature. Usually, this is a person who lives in an apartment in a big city or whatever, and that's the only kind of dog that would work in that small environment. And so it gets back to your point about environment, and what we've done is with the Chihuahuas, we've extracted sort of the descendants of the wolf out of the natural world, the wild, and now they're domesticated and could only exist, in a relationship with us. In other words, you don't even see like feral chihuahuas, just running around in the street like a cat or something. But
cats are never domesticated.
But here, that's an interesting thing to consider, because obviously what we have with domesticated cats is we do have kind of an interesting result, in the sense that again, this is these cats, even though when they're feral, they have an easier time getting around outside and living, like particularly in my neighborhood. The feral cat population in my neighborhood has just exploded, and they're everywhere. And they seem to be doing okay. I guess there are enough birds out there to eat that they have something to keep them alive. But but this is a kind of interesting thing, because we don't think about this relationship. Like, getting back to the salmon illustration, what is it about wild salmon that makes them healthier, et cetera? It's the wild. It's the fact that they're having to struggle to exist. They're swimming upstream. You got farmed salmon, and even when I think they try to simulate the conditions, it's just not the same. They're not as healthy. They're not as healthful to eat. Just interesting stuff to consider.
Yeah. Well, one of the differences, by the way, between dogs and cats is that dogs are pack animals.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that has a lot to do with why cats survive quite nicely, as feral animals. Dogs will always run in packs if they go feral. They'll always travel in packs, whereas cats can operate pretty well on their own. They may live in groups together, but they're still effectively solitary creatures, and they function quite well in that kind of an environment.
Yeah.
So, back to the genetic issue. It seems to me that where this takes my mind, my wife was a wildlife management major, so she's thinking in terms of, okay, how is this different from selective breeding? And I think the cloning technology does introduce a bit of a difference, because we really don't. We're not 100% at cloning. And further, we don't know what genetic propensities that sheep might have that might not mix with our local environment. So it can introduce genetic weaknesses that make it susceptible, and so on, all those kinds of things. But what strikes me personally as more, a more difficult ethical issue is, what would be the implications of this for people and for what we do with various kinds of high-tech reproductive technologies. First of all, we do genetic screening in sperm banks. We actually can, you can actually do designer babies now. You want blonde hair, blue eyes. You want someone who's going to be tall. You want someone whose parents had high IQ. You can do all of these kinds of things, not just through sperm banks, but through embryo banks, effectively. And when it comes to things like surrogacy, that's not exactly a genetic thing, but effectively what you're doing is you're buying and selling people.
Right.
It's human trafficking. So it seems to me that Sheepzilla here is it's a heck of a story, and it does and it raises some interesting questions about wildlife management and animals and those kinds of things. But the implications that it has for reproductive technologies, I think, are huge. And when applied to people, I think you get some. It raises some interesting questions. Like I say, it seems to me that that's the more important direction that in terms of the ethics of the whole thing that this leads to.
Yeah, one of the things that say evolutionists, people who are Darwinists, will kind of talk about when they are talking about their understanding of like the development of human beings over the millennia or whatever, is that this is a kind of an unplanned process. And then they have absolutely no, I guess, reticence to introduce their own intelligence when it comes to things that they're up to with sort of genetic engineering, which is kind of weird. I've often wondered what makes them think that this is going to be a good thing. For if in other words, getting back to my complexity, the observation. Let's say, just for the sake of argument, we have all these people who want to have tall, blue-eyed, blonde-haired kids, but that's maybe a really bad idea for reasons that people aren't able to appreciate. In other words, there may be things about being short or being dark-haired, and the large numbers of people who are shorter and dark-haired in the population that really end up producing a healthier population across the board. If you get my drift, there are things that we just fail to sort of take into our consideration or our calculations when it comes to these sorts of things. We're too confident, I guess, that we can understand what's going on.
There is a line in that kind of naturalism that will see that sort of human consciousness, of course, is a byproduct, an epiphenomena in the philosophical world of our natural bodies, basically. And somehow they have evolved and emerged to this type of complexity that allows us as conscious agents somehow to have a participation through the intelligence that has survived and learned to become conscious of itself, to be a part of directing that evolution. So they would read it this way. Of course, there is a philosophical problem at the heart of that. It's the fact that you using your intelligence to guide it is really just you enacting a script that's already written. So you don't know that it really is the way reality is such. It's just the way you think you have to deal with things to survive. So you don't know it. But then you have that more Cartesian line in which you are sort of this self that rises above the material. And this is kind of a hangover in some modern thinking, even though the naturalism doesn't support it. And that allows people to almost think they're angels in a body that are able to direct the future of evolution through technology to guide it towards these kind of supra natural kind of directions, either reason or mathematics. So you definitely have a lot of inconsistent notions of the human being and human evolution behind a lot of this. But yeah, it doesn't make much sense if you're a sheer materialist or physicalist to think in a very heavy way that scientific intervention through what appears to be some kind of intelligence and intention would be a good thing. Only at best a possible way of helping us survive. And I think for them, that's what they claim. It directs our evolution. In other words, we have enough now of survival to where we can play a part in it more reflectively, I guess.
Yeah. And this moves us into your area, Chris, of transhumanism.
Right. Yeah. That's the thing I've been thinking an awful lot about. As people know, the thing that has been striking is that even though I'm not a technologist, and certainly anybody who works with computers and code and so forth can run rings around me when it comes to that subject. But when it comes to human beings, what it means to be a human being, I'm startled by the naivete and the dunderheadedness of many of these transhumanists. Their understanding of even human history is so flat.
Yeah.
And their understanding of ethics is almost laughable. When you read the stuff that they are spouting as sort of conventional wisdom, or just sort of this is what everybody knows and agrees with. you're like, do you read? Have you ever thought about any of these things? Have you thought that maybe there'd be some philosophers that maybe have addressed this subject in a way that could help you understand what's going on? No, they're just but their confidence is unassailable. I mean, it's just their confidence. I think it has to do with the fact that in their small kind of Silicon Valley bubble, they're like gods, and they really don't have much wisdom when it comes to anything outside that world.
Yeah, and I think they're bedazzled by what technology can do, as many are. I mean, if you it doesn't take long to think of it, but even to think about the kind of world in which technology could do that kind of thing should open up questions more than just what we're capable of as gods, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of the problem is you get this inflated sense of ability and capacity, and then empowered by the advances of technology, and then unhindered by anything that could even in nature or matter make a claim on advancement. And you've created the perfect cocktail for not needing to know anything about the past because you don't see the point in it. And yet those reflections on what it means to be human, I think, are the guardrail of what keeps technology properly human and serving the creation the right way, rather than doing untold damage to that and our soul, for that matter.
Right.
Yeah, I'm rather struck in a lot of ways by comparing this to the 19th century. In the 19th century, where you're truly getting the rise of modern science coming out of the Enlightenment, but it's really a different project than the Enlightenment. Yeah. The Enlightenment was much more philosophically oriented. Yeah. 19th century science, the explosion in science and technology, the Industrial Revolution, all of these kinds of things are far more pragmatically focused and cut off really from any kind of philosophical considerations in a lot of respects. In the 18th century, when you're looking at the transactions of the Royal Philosophical Society, not just the Royal Society, which was a scientific body, when you read the transactions through the 19th century, you see people drawing moral and philosophical and spiritual conclusions out of scientific experiments. Yeah, because they understood science as part of what we call science as part of natural philosophy, that all these things are interrelated. That connection is cut off in the 19th century pretty sharply. Yeah. But what you see happening there are people who are overwhelmingly amazed at their own abilities. And they really see themselves as being on the cutting edge of something new and different and exciting. And isn't this amazing? We have invented a vehicle that can transport large quantities of stuff at 30 miles an hour. Then we've improved it. We can actually go 50 and 60 miles an hour. That 60 miles an hour is difficult because it isn't clear that people can actually breathe when you're going 50, 60 miles an hour. Right. But we're going to try it. This is the world that they were in. And there was a great deal of optimism, excitement about their technology. They thought they were they were on the verge of pretty much everything. They were uncovering the mysteries of the universe. You've got all kinds of advancements in science going on. The foundations for even relativity are set by late 19th century scientists like Maxwell, who, by the way, was an evangelical Christian. But there was still enough of a residual sense that human beings were important, that they were worthwhile, that something should be done for the good of people. There was still enough of that there that I think it on some level curbed the worst of it in one respect. But in another respect, when you get into the 20th century, you have all of the abilities of science and technology harnessed to find more efficient ways of killing large numbers of people on the battlefield.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say, and that then the moral implications become radically complex, especially in dealing with splitting of the atom and the capacities of atomic energy and moving it into the atomic bombs and the capacity you could pretty much wipe out astronomical amounts of people and planet. And that's what's kind of the keeper of the peace.
Well, even in World War I, keep in mind the Battle of the Somme resulted in 1 million casualties.
Wow.
That one battle.
And that was supposed to be the war to end all wars.
Yeah.
We thought that maybe we learned a lesson through that war that, well, apparently not. I guess, related to the kind of the impact of technology on civilization, of course, which is an obvious thing, but human beings and our to use the language of, that's contemporary now, flourishing, human flourishing. There's very little attention given to the unintended consequences of things until after they become so evident that you can't ignore them anymore. An example, a contemporary example, is social media and the mental health impact it's had, particularly on young women. I don't think anybody denies that anymore. But that was not something we were expecting. It's something that we discovered after the fact. Now, I'm in terms of my own disposition, I'm a kind of risk taker, I guess, and I admire anyone who's able to do amazing things, and I admire achievement and stuff like that. But often in the process, there are just a lot of failures. There's a lot of failure, and then there are all these unintended consequences that you have to deal with. I remember here recently learning that Elon Musk, one of the reasons why he's been able to achieve some things that other people and other institutions have not been able to achieve is that his tolerance for failure is very high. So he tells his engineers that unless you're failing 40% of the time, you're not trying hard enough. So he's already built that into their minds that failure is a part of the process that gets you to the place where you can land a rocket. In the way that you see in science fiction movies. So we've gone from having to lose these boosters to being able to recycle them just because, he said, we're just going to keep working at this until we figure it out. And his failure tolerance was huge.
Well, and you see that when there have been failures on launches, he seems absolutely delighted. I mean, it's just
right.
But the analogy I was drawing to the 19th century is very similar to what we see in your transhumanists. They've got the same kind of optimism, the same kind of, I just saw something that came up where people, I think you sent it around, Chris, where people are talking about achieving immortality. We can do this, and it's genetic and it's connecting the biological with the inorganic. It's all of these kinds of things. It's the same kind of optimism that you see in the 19th century, except it's cut off. What's different is it's cut off from any consideration of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, like when I think about, that particular video is Yuval Harari, and he was just describing what's going on in Silicon Valley, when it comes to the project of life extension. And I guess the thing that I'm concerned about when I think about those things is not so much the fact, and not so much the prospect that they'll fail, but actually the prospect that they'll succeed. And I think about the Babel Tower experience and the Lord's judgment that when people work together, they're going to be able to pull off all kinds of things that are just, mind-boggling. But then there's I think to a degree, the foreseeable consequences. I think there are things that we could predict coming out of that. Mm-hmm. First of all, the technology is likely to be very expensive and only available to the wealthiest people.
Absolutely.
So, and then there's going to be a series of sort of economic implications. Whole industries will be basically no longer needed. Let's say that they're able to even like democratize this to such an extent that maybe even 20% of the population can see their lifespans extend to 3, 4, 500 years or whatever. Well, the childlessness problem is exacerbated because there's just there's no real compelling reason to have kids. And then what do you do with all these other people who are, clamoring for access to the same technology, but it's just prohibitively expensive and it's not going to be ever accessible to everybody? What does that do for your world? It creates two classes of people. We already have classes of people, but I'm thinking about something much more dramatic and unstable. Why would people who are like, consigned to an 80-year lifespan be content with that when there are people who are living hundreds of years? Do you think maybe that people would take up arms to change the situation?
You want an example? Look at Blade Runner.
Mm-hmm.
The basic principle in Blade Runner is you've got these replicants, they call them, that are genetically engineered. They're actually superior to people in most respects,
Right.
but as a fail-safe, they're given a short lifespan.
Right.
And the one thing that they want is to live longer.
Mm-hmm.
And they are looking desperately, trying to find a way that they can just stay alive.
Right.
And that is the source of, really, to me, the pathos in the movie.
Oh yeah, sure.
But imagine now if instead of that you have 80% of the population that's in that situation.
Right.
What you're asking for is flat out revolution.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that some popular figure, some demagogic leader would try to organize some kind of effort to steal away the tech and democratize it.
Yeah, and of course, to prevent that, what you will have is a totalitarian system in place to absolutely prevent any attempted organization.
Yep, I think that's
right.
I
mean, this is where this kind of thing inevitably goes.
Right. Yeah, and the people who are playing with this stuff, they're actually, as I'm reading the literature written by transhumanists, they've actually anticipated all this stuff. It's really crazy. They've anticipated it, but they're willing to still throw the dice and say, let's go for it. And again, kind of taking us back to the things that we're talking about that are apparently less consequential, cloning, in vitro fertilization, genetic modification, whether it means CRISPR or breeding or whatever. Somewhere along the line, you got to be content with the way things are.
Well, see, this is interesting because a lot of the roots of this, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them come out of, as Glenn was talking about, 17th century theologies that were kind of mixed in with natural philosophy. I mean, we've talked about it before. You talk about the notion of, now because Christ has showed up and the gospel has come, we also have been given insight into Eden, if you will. And we're able through natural sciences to discern essences again and purposes. Well, they're not so important, but we can understand how nature works to fix, to heal, maybe to renew. And so maybe our natural science and technology is just a part of our dominion restored and allowing us to contribute to the fixing of things until they're ultimately fixed. And so just like human death and the limitations, first generations lived 900 years, the next one, 1,000. And then it kind of got shorter and shorter because of the consequences of the fall, certain judgment. Now that's reversed. And then rip the theology away from it and then just let the science run wild with the imagination still shaped by that we're made for immortality, and that we have a place and a capacity to do it, And then you do have this kind of, if you will, a scientific theology.
Well, the thing, like when you think about it, Elon's quest to make a interplanetary species, and then his very pro-natal philosophy, it reminds me of Weston in Out of the Silent Planet. It really does. Weston's whole kind of aspiration is very muskish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of rooting for Elon not getting possessed by the devil.
Right. Yeah, he's a mixed bag, as so many people are. But basically, the more potential you have for good, the more you have for evil as well. I was listening to an interview with him and Tucker Carlson, and Elon was reminiscing about a conversation he had with Larry Page, the Google guy. And when Elon was talking with Page, they were friends, but this particular episode ended that friendship because Page accused accused Musk of being a speciesist because he favored human beings over artificial intelligence. So, in other words, Page believes that artificial intelligence is a new form of life, a silicon-based form of life. So these guys actually think they're creating new forms of or new creatures that have a different medium in which they live, but they're as real as you and me, and are should have the same kinds of rights, even civil rights, as the rest of us. I'm reading a book by Mo Gaudet. That's an argument that he's making. That's a premise that he is operating on.
Well, go ahead, Glenn.
Well, that raises all sorts of interesting questions about what cloning would mean in that context, but I don't think I want to go there.
Yeah. Well, I do think that it's something to think about. So let's say, we've thought a little bit about the idea of uploading your consciousness onto a silicon-based system. This is what someone like Ray Kurzweil is known for. But let's say we could clone ourselves, and there was a procedure that we could actually introduce that would allow memories and other sort of experiences and skills to be uploaded into the body that's waiting for us. That is our own, cloned body, and you could kind of continue your life in some form in that way, almost like a kind of. You just keep replacing yourself in a process of cloning. Now I'm just speculating. I'm thinking about weird stuff.
It is interesting in the classic Christian theology that resurrection has a certain kind of continuity and transformation all at the same time. There is a transfigurement, but take Christ, for example, there is also the scars. So this continuity of body related to what it means to carry on the identity of the same person is very fundamental. It doesn't really play into a speculation that you kind of, even though there is a distinction between soul and body, it's not the kind of thing that is the habitat and the human body that has some continuity from birth to resurrection, shares in that continued identity. So, I mean, we used to talk about this a lot in philosophy when we deal with the mind-body certain conceptions like Descartes, you can do that kind of thing, and that's why philosophers will say, "Is this a ghost in a machine?" Right. That you can just keep, somehow. Well, first for Ryle, he didn't think there was anything in there. It's just the machine, and consciousness is just a byproduct of it. I think you have to buy into that kind of notion that consciousness and spirit, soul, mind are really extensions of the machine. And yet you can find a host of different machines to still somehow hold your
Yeah,
conscience.
I think there are a couple of things to consider here. I do think, and this is something that John Lennox mentions in his book 2084. He says that we have to reconcile ourselves to some form of substance dualism. Now, we don't need to be Cartesian, but there needs to be at least an acknowledgement that there is a body and that there is a soul. I mean, this is something that the Lord, tells us.
Yeah.
A quick sidelight. What you were describing about uploading your consciousness and then downloading it into a new body. A science fiction author, probably writing in the early 70s, maybe even the late 60s, by the name of Roger Zelazny, wrote a book.
I remember him. Yeah.
He wrote a book called Lord of Light. And in Lord of Light, what he speculated on, his thing was, suppose we had the technology to have an elite group that could set themselves up functionally as the Hindu gods.
Yeah.
And they develop a system of reincarnation that is exactly what you described.
Yeah. Well, it might seem completely unfeasible just at a technical level, but with quantum computing, we're kind of talking about a whole different animal. Quantum computing is just crazy in terms of its capacities.
Yeah.
So I was listening to an interview with Jeffrey Hinton, who is the guy that came up with the neural network approach to artificial intelligence, and he did it mainly because he was working on trying to understand the human brain, and he didn't make the progress on that research like he wanted to. So he just took what he had learned in terms of neural connections in the human brain and applied that to tech, and that's where we get the neural net work learning system. That was the breakthrough. That was the breakthrough that gives us artificial intelligence. But artificial intelligence, he says, is at about 1 trillion connections at the current state of things. The human brain has 100 million or 100 trillion connections, neural connections. So you and I have 100 times the connections that the current state of artificial intelligence possesses. But they're able to get a lot more out of those 100 out of the 1 trillion than the 100 trillion because of the narrow focus. But I guess the thing that's intriguing is with quantum computing, it's not inconceivable that your brain could be analyzed and the neural kind of connections that currently exist could be reproduced in the exact down to the individual connections, neural connections that are there. So an exact duplicate of your brain could be created.
But it'd be curious to know if the qualia or the experience center would always be the same.
Great.
And that's what's always...
Yeah. Well, and then there are a host of other problems. For example, is the mind the same as the brain?
Right.
Well, that's right. And this is, I think, this like classic views, hylomorphism, a notion where basically the body is ensouled, and so the body is derivative in some ways, and they're so connected, body and soul, or mind, used in this case, that there isn't a material nature apart from that ensoulment, which has mind there. So they're much more interwoven, even though they are distinguishable. And yet also you have another tradition in which really the body is fundamentally derivative. Intentional consciousness is not a natural activity. It's a spiritual and intellectual mode that is never reducible to the natural. The natural, if anything, is a byproduct in some Christian traditions of spirit and mind, which is primary, rather than the other way around. So there's a lot of theological things that are unresolved in our way of even reading these kinds of...
Well, David Bentley Hart kind of takes that approach in his own understanding of the material
Christian
world.
Approach.
But isn't it interesting that we find ourselves now at a place where, sort of the objections to the resurrection that were so sort of considered obvious in the 19th and 18th centuries are actually now almost considered to be, I guess you could say, anachronistic. In other words, there was a belief that, resurrection is just, something that is impossible. But today, just knowing what we know about, our potential capacity to like replicate human beings, suddenly we're in a new place where we're like, no, resurrection, yeah, that's workable. I mean, if you had enough intelligence and enough power, yeah, you could pull that off.
Yeah, and we know exactly how that works out. We've read about this already in Frankenstein.
That's right.
But the other thing, though, all right, let's just forget the philosophical question of mind-body dualism. Let's look at some of the biological things. What makes you isn't just your brain. It's hormones. It's what's going on in your gut. It's all kinds of other things.
Right.
Just simply, even if you could reproduce the brain as a thinking organ, does not reproduce you, because you are not just your brain.
Right.
I mean, there's a host of other things that these guys seem not to even be thinking about. How do you deal with with like said hormones? How do you deal with your second brain, which is what's going on in your gut? How do you deal with all of these other elements? There's just not, anyway, I don't see any possible way that they can even begin to get to those kinds of things.
Yeah, I agree, and it kind of takes us back to this matter of things being far more complex than we appreciate and interconnected than we can appreciate.
Yeah. So, this is kind of wide ranging, and again, we still haven't even gotten into some of the ethical issues surrounding reproductive technologies. I mean, we moved into the transhumanist stuff, which is obviously related to Sheepzilla here,
Right.
but there are a whole host of similar kinds of questions that need to be raised. It seems to me, not just on the transhumanist side, but even with the technologies that we are currently using now. There are, it seems to me, strong ethical issues that we simply are not even considering. We're not even willing to address. By the way, we do use cloning of embryonic stem cells. We don't use, we don't use embryonic stem cells. Bush prohibited embryonic stem cells except for stem cell lines that were already in use. It turns out that Obama lifted those restrictions, but there's not a single cure that has been developed out of embryonic stem cells.
Isn't that interesting? Huh.
It turns out that there's another class of stem cells that are drawn from non-embryo destructive stem cells.
Right.
And there have been a host of cures that have come from that.
Interesting.
But embryo destructive stem cells, not a single cure has come from them.
Well, in God's providence, yeah.
And yet they still insist that we need to be doing this there hasn't been as much discussion of that, but that's largely because Obama eliminated any ethical issues from it. It's just the scientists and the technologists that are making these kinds of decisions. The President's Council that deals with bioethical issues, I don't even know if it's still in existence, but they actually under Obama removed everybody who had any training in ethics from it.
Yeah, that's not surprising.
Yeah, and it becomes sort of culturally normalized in the sense that most of the time we see certain prohibitions lifted, life still goes on, and so people just think, oh, okay, no big deal, and they don't really know how big a deal these things really are. And I think maybe it doesn't affect most people in their day-to-day lives, but then you start to see it show up in day-to-day lives. I mean, we see it with different issues, but really playing around, just the whole notion back to the designer baby. It's just it's all the worst kind of things of consumerism coupled with our fallen nature looking for some kind of glory or fame through having something made in our image according to our likeness by our choosing it.
Right. The idea, fundamentally what it comes down to, it seems to me, is having children is now increasingly seen as simply being a lifestyle choice. It's
Right.
a lifestyle option. This is something I can choose to do, like I can choose to buy a designer suit.
Right.
And if I want to have a designer suit, I want to have a really nice designer suit that meets my specifications.
Yeah.
If I want to have a child, I want to have a child that meets my specifications. If I'm using technology to get the child. Personally, I think it's a lot more fun to get them the natural way.
Right.
But but if you are in if you aren't willing to go through, well, if you're in a same-sex relationship or something like that, and you decide you want a child, you can't do that. So I'm going to pick my designer baby.
Yeah, the striking thing about that, of course, is the willingness to experiment on a child. In so far as you're introducing a child to something that would have been considered in an unnatural environment just up until maybe 20 years ago, and you've removed from that child's daily life ongoing contact with the sex that's not present, and there are many implications that I think will follow and are following. I'm waiting for a whole set of class action lawsuits on a range of things. I think we're probably 10 to 20 years away from them, but I think we're going to have all sorts of stuff related to transgenderism, experiments with family structure, all kinds of things that people are going to say, you guys experimented on me and I've paid the price. And I can't get you to, I can't go back in time and get you to do something different, but at least I can punish you with a huge lawsuit. Anyway, on that thought, we should probably wrap up. We're already over time. You wanted to say something though, Glenn?
Just one quick note. If you're interested in that particular issue, Katie Faust has an organization called Them Before Us, which is really worth checking out.
Okay.
So just
we should put that in the show notes.
Yeah. So
anyway, thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We've come to the end of another episode. We're in the 300s now, and it's just astonishing to sort of appreciate the fact that we've had over 300 conversations. We're still friends. Anyway, we hope you're our friend too, and if you are feeling very friendly, you can make a commitment to the show by going to our Patreon page and learning about what it means to give to the show on a regular basis. We could use your help there. We have bills that need to be paid, and you can help pay them if you do that. Anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.